Somewhere over the Gulf of Tonkin, June 1966, a Vought F-8 Crusader, battered, trailing hydraulic fluid from a line no mechanic would ever patch, limped southeast toward the USS Hancock. Its left wing carried a hole the size of a man's fist where a 23mm round had punched clean through the skin and missed the spar by inches. The pilot, Lieutenant Commander Cole Black, was flying with half his instruments dark and a control stick that fought him on every input. Behind him, falling in loose pieces through 14,000 feet of humid air, was what remained of a MiG-21 Fishbed. The Soviet Union's proudest interceptor, the aircraft NATO planners had spent 3 years losing sleep over. No ejection had been observed. Hanoi would list the pilot as missing. The engagement had lasted less than 90 seconds. How did a Navy fighter designed in 1953, an aircraft older than most of its own pilots, keep killing the jet that was supposed to make it obsolete? The MiG-21 was faster. It climbed better. On paper, it represented everything the Crusader wasn't, a Mach 2 missile platform built for the supersonic age. Soviet advisors in Hanoi had assured the Vietnamese People's Air Force that the Fishbed would dominate any American fighter it met, and they had reason for confidence. The MiG-21 had been engineered specifically to counter Western aircraft in the kind of hit-and-run slashing attacks that favored speed and altitude. Against the heavier, older F-8, it should have been no contest. And yet the Crusader's kill ratio against the MiG-21 told a story that made Soviet analysts quietly furious. The F-8 wasn't just competing. It was winning decisively in the one domain that was supposed to belong to the Fishbed, close-range air combat. Before I go deeper into how a 50s-era gunfighter humiliated the most modern Soviet jet in the sky, drop a comment and tell me what you think gave the Crusader its edge. Was it the pilot, the plane, something else entirely? Stick around to the end and see if you were right, and if this one surprises you, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. The answer wasn't simple, and it wasn't just one thing. It was a collision of design philosophy, pilot culture, and a brutal miscalculation by the men who built the MiG-21 about what air combat over Vietnam would actually look like. The Soviets had designed their fighter for a war that never came. High-altitude interceptions against American bombers streaking toward Moscow at 50,000 feet. What they got instead was a knife fight in a phone booth down in the weeds over the Red River Delta, where the Crusader's heavy cannon armament and its pilots' obsessive devotion to dogfighting turned every engagement into exactly the kind of battle the MiG-21 was never meant to survive. The Fishbed was a sprinter forced into a wrestling match, and the Crusader had been wrestling its whole life. The numbers don't lie, but they do shock. During the Vietnam War, F-8 Crusader pilots achieved an air-to-air kill ratio that outperformed every other American fighter in the theater, including aircraft that were newer, faster, and carried more sophisticated weapon systems. The Crusader squadrons, flying what the Navy had already begun treating as a second-line fighter, compiled a record of 18 confirmed aerial victories against only 3 losses in air-to-air combat. That's a 6-to-1 exchange rate, achieved in an aircraft the Pentagon was actively trying to replace. Put that in context. The F-4 Phantom, the aircraft the Navy had chosen as the Crusader's successor, the one that cost 3 times as much and carried a radar that could lock targets beyond visual range, managed a kill ratio closer to 2-to-1 over the same period. The Air Force's numbers were even worse. Across the entire American air campaign, no platform matched what the F-8 did, pound for pound, against North Vietnamese fighters, and no platform did it with fewer resources. Crusader squadrons were smaller. They flew fewer sorties. They received less institutional support, less funding, and virtually no attention from the admirals who were already betting the fleet's future on the Phantom. The F-8 community was, by 1966, a shrinking tribe of pilots who had been told their aircraft was yesterday's news, and who kept proving that yesterday's news could still kill you. What makes those numbers even more remarkable is the opposition they were compiled against. The VPAF was not a collection of amateurs. North Vietnamese pilots trained extensively with Soviet and Chinese instructors, flew disciplined ground-controlled intercept profiles, and operated under a tactical doctrine specifically designed to exploit American weaknesses. They knew the rules of engagement that Washington imposed on its own pilots, the restrictions that prohibited firing beyond visual range in most circumstances, the requirements for positive identification that forced American fighters to close within cannon range before they could shoot. Hanoi's fighter controllers used those restrictions like a weapon, vectoring MiGs into slashing attacks from the blind spots that American formations couldn't cover, then pulling them away before the heavier American jets could turn to engage. It was a strategy built on speed, surprise, and disengagement, and it worked beautifully against the Phantom, whose pilots had been trained to fight with missiles at distance and often found themselves helpless when the fight collapsed into a close-range tangle. Against the Crusader, that strategy fell apart, and it fell apart for reasons that went deeper than any single technical advantage. The F-8 community was different. Not just different in equipment, different in mentality and training, different in the fundamental assumptions its pilots carried into combat about what an air-to-air engagement was supposed to look like. Crusader pilots expected the close fight. They wanted it. While Phantom crews were trained to maintain separation and fire radar-guided Sparrow missiles from miles away, F-8 pilots practiced dogfighting with a religious intensity that their Phantom counterparts found almost primitive. They flew against each other constantly, refining the kind of high-G nose-to-tail maneuvering that the missile age was supposed to have made irrelevant. They understood energy management, when to trade altitude for speed, when to accept a slower turn to maintain the ability to accelerate out of trouble, when to commit to a gun solution, and when to break off and reset. They had, in the language of fighter aviation, superior situational awareness in the visual arena. And they had it because they practiced there every single day, in an aircraft that rewarded exactly that kind of flying. The MiG-21 pilots who came screaming down out of 20,000 feet expecting to slash through an American formation and escape before anyone could react discovered something unpleasant when their target was an F-8 instead of an F-4. The Crusader didn't behave the way American fighters were supposed to behave. It turned into the attack instead of away from it and followed the MiG through its escape maneuver. Then it closed the distance that the MiG-21's entire tactical doctrine depended on maintaining. And when the Crusader got close, when the fight devolved into the kind of a slow-speed, high-angle-of-attack knife fight that Soviet tacticians had assured their Vietnamese students would never happen, the MiG-21 found itself in a world it had not been built for, against a pilot who had spent his entire career preparing for exactly this moment. "The gun is the last argument of a fighter pilot," said John Cheshire, a Crusader ace who understood that truth in his bones. It was also the first argument, the one that decided everything when the missiles went stupid, when the radar lost lock, when the elegant theories of beyond visual range combat collapsed into the sweating, grunting reality of two fighters circling each other at 400 knots with nothing between them but sky and intent. The F-8's 420mm Colt cannons were not a backup weapon. They were the point. Each one fired 100 rounds per second, a combined rate of fire that could saw a MiG in half with a 1-second burst. While Phantom crews carried Sparrow and Sidewinder missiles that failed at rates approaching 50% in the humid, flare-saturated skies over Vietnam, the Crusader pilot carried something that didn't care about electronic countermeasures or radar lock, something that didn't lose track of its target because of ground clutter. Bullets went where you pointed them. And the F-8's pilots had been pointing them at each other in training for years. But the gun alone wasn't enough. You had to get close enough to use it, and you had to survive long enough to pull the trigger. That's where the wing came in. The Crusader's variable-incidence wing, a design so unusual that no other production fighter ever copied it, gave the aircraft something that looked almost like cheating in a dogfight. The entire wing tilted upward 7 degrees for takeoff and landing, allowing the fuselage to remain level while the wing generated the lift needed for carrier operations at low speed. In combat, That same wing geometry gave the F-8 a nose authority that heavier fighters couldn't match. The Crusader could pull its nose onto a target faster, sustain a tighter turn at moderate speeds, hold controlled flight at angles of attack, where the MiG-21's delta wing would stall and depart, and still have energy left to press the attack. In the slow-speed fight, the fight that mattered, the fight that every Vietnam engagement eventually became, the F-8 could go places the MiG simply could not follow.
The British had tried something similar in the Falklands 16 years later, Harrier pilots using thrust vectoring to decelerate violently and force Argentine fighters to overshoot, exploiting a maneuvering advantage that existed in a speed regime their opponents never expected to enter. The principle was identical. Force the enemy into the part of the envelope where your aircraft is superior and his is vulnerable.
The Crusader pilots of Vietnam had discovered it first, not through engineering innovation, but through the relentless practice of fighting in that envelope until it felt like home. And that was the third pillar, the one that multiplied everything else: the culture. Crusader squadrons attracted a specific kind of naval aviator, the pilot who believed that air combat was personal and physical, fundamentally about skill rather than technology. These were men who distrusted missiles on principle and considered the Phantom's reliance on radar-guided weapons a form of institutional cowardice. Men who trained for the dogfight the way boxers train for the ring every day against live opponents, with an intensity that left them wrung out and grinning. By the standards of the modern Navy, they were anachronisms. They were also the deadliest air-to-air pilots in the theater. The MiG-21 had been designed to fight machines. What it got instead were craftsmen who had turned their machine into an extension of their own reflexes. The proof isn't in the statistics. It's in the stories, and the stories are violent. On June 21, 1966, Commander Hal Marr of VF-211 was flying escort for an A-4 strike package near Hanoi when his wingman called out two MiG-21s dropping through the overcast at their 7 o'clock. The MiGs were already inside missile range. Soviet doctrine said they should have been untouchable, committed to a supersonic slash, too fast for an older American fighter to track, gone before anyone could react. Marr broke into the lead MiG so hard he grayed out, pulled 7.5 Gs through a descending left turn that bled the fight down from Mach 1.2 to under 400 knots in 8 seconds. The MiG-21 pilot, trained to extend and escape at speed, instead tried to match the turn. It was the last decision he made as a fighter pilot. At 300 knots, the Fishbed's delta wing was a liability. Draggy, unstable, bleeding energy like an open wound. Marr rolled wings level for 1 heartbeat, put the pipper on the MiG's tailpipe, and squeezed. A 2-second burst from all 4 cannons turned the Fishbed into a fireball that tumbled through 12,000 feet of sky and hit the karst ridgeline below without a parachute in sight. Marr's gun camera footage would later be used in training films. The engagement, from first visual to kill, lasted 43 seconds. 3 months later, Lieutenant Commander Dick Bellinger of VF-162 fought a MiG-21 to a standstill over Phuc Yen airfield, the most heavily defended piece of airspace in North Vietnam, ringed with SAMs and anti-aircraft batteries that could reach 30,000 feet. Bellinger had followed his MiG down through the flak envelope, ignoring the doctrine that said disengage above the AAA belt, because he had the Fishbed exactly where he wanted it. Slow, nose high, out of ideas. The MiG pilot attempted a last-ditch vertical roll to shake the Crusader off his 6. Bellinger followed him through it, not matching the maneuver, but cutting across its radius, using the F-8's superior nose authority to keep his guns tracking, while the MiG wallowed through the top of its arc. He fired at a range of 800 feet. Pieces of the MiG-21 struck his own aircraft. He landed aboard the Oriskany with aluminum fragments embedded in his radome, and a confirmed kill that the intelligence debriefers called one of the most aggressive engagements of the war. These weren't lucky shots. They were the product of pilots who had internalized a single unforgiving truth, that in the merging of two fighters, the one who commits fully, who turns harder, closes faster, accepts more risk, is the one who walks away. The MiG-21 was designed for pilots who would fight by committee, executing ground-controlled profiles handed to them by radar operators 50 miles from the fight. The Crusader was flown by men who made their own decisions at 6 Gs with their vision tunneling and their arms shaking. That difference killed more MiGs than any missile ever built. In a classroom at Naval Air Station Miramar, November 1968, a captain named Frank Ault stood before a chalkboard covered in kill ratio data and told a room full of flag officers what none of them wanted to hear. The United States Navy had forgotten how to dogfight, and the proof was written in the blood of its own aircrew. The Ault Report, 480 pages of institutional autopsy, laid bare every failure that the Crusader's success had already demonstrated by contrast. Missile reliability was catastrophic. Sparrow missiles fired in combat achieved a kill probability under 10%. Sidewinders were better, but not by enough. Pilot training in air combat maneuvering had been gutted by a peacetime Navy that believed dogfighting was obsolete, replaced by systems management courses that taught crews to operate radar consoles rather than fly fighters. The fleet had spent a decade building an air-to-air force around technologies that didn't work, operated by men who hadn't been taught the skills that did. And the evidence had been there the entire time, in the kill boards of the Crusader squadrons, whose pilots had been doing everything the rest of the Navy had stopped doing and winning because of it. What came out of the Ault Report was Top Gun. The Navy Fighter Weapons School, established at Miramar in March 1969, was built on principles that every Crusader pilot would have recognized as his own daily routine. Fly against dissimilar aircraft that replicate enemy tactics. Fight at close range, train for the merge, not the beyond visual range shot. Emphasize the gun, emphasize energy management. Emphasize the kind of aggressive, fluid, improvisational combat that no missile and no radar could replace. The instructors, many of them former Crusader pilots, taught Phantom crews to fight the way F-8 crews had always fought, and it worked. By the time linebacker operations began in 1972, Navy kill ratios had climbed from 2-to-1 to 12-to-1. The Air Force, which had no equivalent program, saw no improvement at all. The Crusader never got the credit. By 1972, the F-8 was gone from frontline fighter squadrons, relegated to reconnaissance and reserve units, its pilots scattered into Phantom cockpits or staff billets or retirement. The aircraft that had proven the thesis that human skill in the close fight mattered more than any technological advantage was quietly retired, while the institution it had saved went on to build its future around the lessons it had taught. No memorial, no ceremony. Just a handful of aging gun camera films and the testimony of men who had been there, who had turned into the MiGs when everyone else was turning away, and who understood that the best fighter in any war is the one flown by a pilot who refuses to lose. Phil Vampatella flew his last combat sortie in a Crusader over Route Package 6 in 1968. Landed aboard the Bonhomme Richard with battle damage he didn't bother to report, and never flew the aircraft again. The Navy had already decided the F-8's war was over. Vampatella transferred to Phantoms. So did most of them. The men who had built the doctrine that would save the next generation of naval aviation poured into cockpits designed around the very philosophy they had spent years proving wrong. They adapted. They brought the knife-fighting instincts with them. And quietly, without anyone naming it as such, the Crusaders' way of war became the Navy's way of war. The irony was never lost on the men who lived it. The F-8 had been labeled obsolete before the first MiG kill. Too old, too simple, too dependent on a pilot's hands and eyes in an age that worshipped radar screens and missile envelopes. What Vietnam proved was that the Crusader wasn't a relic of the past. It was a prototype of the future. Every principle that Top Gun would codify, every tactic that would transform Navy air-to-air performance between 1969 and 1972, had been field-tested by Crusader pilots who didn't need a school to teach them what they already practiced every day. The Navy didn't invent a new doctrine. It remembered an old one, the one the F-8 squadrons had never abandoned. The Soviet pilots and their North Vietnamese students had been told the MiG-21 was the superior machine. On paper, in the metrics that mattered to engineers and procurement officers, they were right. The Fishbed was faster, newer, built for the war that theorists on both sides believed was coming. What the theorists missed, what the GCI controllers in their bunkers outside Hanoi could never see on their screens, was that air combat in 1966 looked almost nothing like air combat was supposed to look. It looked like 1943. It looked like two pilots, close enough to see each other's helmets, turning as hard as their bodies and their machines could stand, waiting for the half-second window that separated a kill from a miss. In that fight, the MiG-21 pilots were not outclassed by technology. They were outclassed by men who had spent their careers preparing for exactly this moment and refused to believe it would never come. Today, 14 Crusaders survive. Most sit on pylons outside naval air stations or in the climate-controlled quiet of aviation museums, Pensacola, the Smithsonian's Udvar Hazy Center, the Midway Museum in San Diego. Their variable-incidence wings are locked in the raised position, frozen in the attitude of a carrier approach they will never complete. The paint schemes are wrong on half of them, restored by volunteers working from photographs that didn't capture the right shade of gull gray. The cockpits are sealed. The guns are empty. Thousands of miles east, in a military museum outside Moscow, a MiG-21 sits in similar silence. Same era, same war, different side of the same story. Hal Marr, who killed the first MiG-21 ever downed by a Crusader, was once asked what made the F-8 different from every other fighter in the inventory. He thought about it for a moment. "It fought like we did," he said. "Mean, close, and personal."